Haruhi Suzumiya was behaving herself. Neither melancholy nor sighing, and in point of fact not even seeming bored. She had of late been strangely quiet, and that inexplicable calmness worried me. I'm not, of course, talking about a physical quietness, much less an emotional one. For one thing, Haruhi doesn't have the self-doubt it would take to alter her already formed personality, and even if she did, that would probably wind up turning into a different kind of pain in the ass for me. So I had no intention of attempting to remedy that situation. But in any case, it was like the color of her aura as it might show up in Kirklian photography had dimmed from red to a kind of orange. Among her classmates, there was only one or maybe two at the outside who would have noticed the change. I can tell you with certainty who one of them was. Me. She sat directly behind me ever since we started high school, and I see even more of her after school, so nobody's in a better position to notice such changes. And while it may seem calmer at the moment, her gaze that challenges all of creation is still there, as well as her action potential, tireless until satisfied. She only managed to get second place at the school-wide Hyakuin Isshu poetry memorization competition late last month, but this month she had won the school marathon. Incidentally, it was Nagato who won the Hyakuin Isshu, and she placed second in the marathon. Excelling in fields both literary and martial with their 1-2 finishes, the SOS Brigade chief and the resident bookworm had the entire school, including me, wondering just what the brigade was up to. If there was one thing I was sure I understood, based on my experiences thus far, it was that when Haruhi got like this, she was without a doubt formulating some kind of evil scheme, and once she hit upon it, her face would light up with a smile, as surely as the sun rises. I can't remember any instances of that not happening. Have there been any? Were there any sections of this history book within my mind where Haruhi had stayed calm and constant? The worst storms are always portended by a fleeting calm. It has ever been thus. So then, it is early February, the final stage of winter's coldest period. The last year, with all its insanity, is now more than a month gone. If it felt as if time had passed especially quickly, it was probably due to January being full of activities surrounding New Year's. Here I'd like to turn back time for a moment. I had no idea what Haruhi may have been planning, but I had my own business to come to terms with. February might seem too early to be already looking back on the year, but I've decided to tell the story of something I had to do. No, something I wanted to do. During the whole thing, I had a single notion running through my head. Finish what has been left undone, as quickly as I could. Although it was during the winter break trip that I made up my mind to do this, I needed some time before I could put into action. The story starts on the second day of January, in front of the same train station we always use. The winter vacation affair had us stranded in the middle of a blizzard and trapped within a mysterious mansion that ended on the 2nd of January, with the return of the SOS Brigade from its training camp deep in the mountains. Phew! We're home! Haruhi greeted our little suburb, narrowing her eyes at the setting sun. It's always relaxing to be home. Snowy mountains are nice and all, but nothing beats the smell of home, even if it's a little musty. Having taken a different route, the Tamaru brothers, along with Mori and Arakawa, were no longer with us. Thus, the only ones collecting their luggage at the small, homey train station were Haruhi and Tsuruya, with their tireless super ally constitutions, Asahina, to whom my sister clung positively, and the expressionless as always Nagato, along with Koizumi, who wore a tired, resigned smile, and me, holding Shamisen the cat in a carrier. I had the feeling that it was still plenty of people. Well, that's all for today. Haruhi's face was content. Everybody make sure to rest up. We're hitting the neighborhood shrines and temples for Hatsumure tomorrow, got it? Meet here at 9 a.m. Oh, Tsuruya, do you have any plans? You have to admire the kind of vitality that lets someone make plans to go back out the day after returning home from a trip, especially for something like a New Year's temple visit. But unfortunately, ordinary humans, take me for example, aren't powered by internal perpetual motion machines. Tsuruya seemed to have a capacity to match Haruhi's as she replied though. Sorry, I'm heading to Switzerland tomorrow. I'll bring back souvenirs though, so toss a little extra in the offering boxes for me, okay? Tsuruya dug some small change out of her wallet and handed it to Asahina, continuing, Here, a New Year's present. She gave some to my little sister too. Bye-bye, see you next semester! She smiled and waved as she left the station. She seemed totally relaxed. It was enough to make me want to ask her parents just how they raised a daughter like that, just for my own future reference. Well then, shall we all head home? Take care, everybody. The club trip isn't over until you make it home. If anything else happened, I doubted Koizumi or I would be able to handle it, but surely nothing weird would happen in the time it would take for us to return to our homes from the train station. Right? I looked at Nagato. The affliction she suffered in the mystery house had vanished, and she returned to her normal, impossible-to-read state of expressionlessness. But just as I was about to note this, her eyes moved slightly, and her gaze met mine. I don't think the tiny nod I perceived from her was an illusion. I then looked at Asahina. She had been largely oblivious during the entire trip. Her cluelessness had spilled over into uncertainty during the Mystery House episode, but in retrospect, that may have been for the best. She would have a much larger role to play starting now. I looked at her meaningfully, but unfortunately she missed my signals completely, instead playing happily with my sister as though they were all the same age. Okay, see you all tomorrow. Make sure to grab your New Year's money. There are going to be stalls lined up all around the shrines and temples. Once Haruhi said her piece, I left her and Asahina and boarded the bus, dragging my sister and Shamisen, and his cat carrier, on board with me. Bye, Mikuru! As I hauled my recalcitrant sister back to the bus seat, Asahina waved repeatedly with one hand, her other slightly clenched. I didn't really feel like waving, although Haruhi and Koizumi probably would have just yelled a loud bye-bye. A few minutes after we returned home, and I got Shamisen and my sister out of my hair, I called the 2 brigade members of whom I'd just taken my leave. Why? Because there was something I deeply regretted leaving undone before the year's end, and I wanted to fix that as soon as possible. I didn't want to break out in a cold sweat because of my own laziness like that ever again. And while part of me wanted to go back and teach myself of late last year a lesson or two, I needed to go back a little further. Thanks to Nagato and Koizumi's efforts, we managed to avoid the worst case scenario at the mysterious lodge, but there was no guarantee we wouldn't wind up in a similar situation again. In fact, it seemed unavoidable. I hesitated to take action during the trip, reasoning that it would cause trouble, but now that the club members had gone their separate ways, I would dither no further. I had plenty of time to make up my mind during the game playing and mystery solving at Tsuruya's villa. I had to go. I had to go with Nagato and Asahina back to that day. Yes, back to the morning of December 18th. Without taking any time to recover from the exhaustion of the winter trip, I first called Asahina. She sounded a bit surprised to be receiving a phone call from someone with whom she parted ways so recently. Oh, Kyon, what is it? There's somewhere I want you to go with me, immediately if possible. What? Where? December 18th of last year. She sounded confused and taken aback. What do you mean? I want you to take Nagato and me back in time. The 3 of us have to go back 2 weeks. What? No, my TP... I just can't change time whenever I want to. It takes thorough investigation and the permission of a lot of people. I was willing to bet she'd have no trouble getting that permission. My mind filled with the image of Asahina the Elder, winking at me and blowing me a kiss. Asahina, please contact your superiors or whatever they are immediately. Tell them I want to return to the morning of December 18th with you and Nagato. Maybe thanks to my overconfident tone, Asahina's little sounds of hesitation that leaked through the phone's receiver fell silent. Wait just a moment. Oh, I waited. I was fascinated to know how just one communicated with the future, but all I could hear was the quiet sound of Asahina's breathing. After no more than 10 seconds of that background music. I don't believe it. Her voice sounded dazed. I've received permission, but why? Why so easily? It was because the future now rested on my shoulders, but I didn't want to have a long conversation about it, so I just said, let's meet at Nagato's apartment. You could be there in half an hour, right? Wait, hold on, let me have an hour. I want to confirm with this again. And also, I would rather just, meet in front of Nagato's apartment building. I readily agreed. Then, after taking a moment to grin privately at Asahina's surprise, I straightened and turned serious again. The time period I was proposing to revisit was not only one that inspired a pleasant smile. I knew that better than anyone else. The next person I planned to contact would probably have understood everything without even saying a word, but better safe than sorry. I picked up the phone again. An hour later. I arrived early, having gotten excited and sprinted over on my bike. I had been waiting at the entrance to Nagato's luxurious apartment for 15 minutes, stomping my feet to starve out the cold. Finally, a fluffy-looking silhouette approached. Either she hadn't thought to change clothes or hadn't had time, although to be fair, neither had I. Kyon. Asahina looked at me, full of wonderment. I just don't understand it. Why was your request so easily granted? Not just that, I was ordered to go with you and Nagato. When I asked for details, it was totally classified, and I was instructed to do everything you tell me to do. Why? I'll explain. In Nagato's room, I said, punching the code for Nagato's room into the panel in the entryway, then pushing the buzzer. The response was quick. It's me. Come in. I passed right through the now unlocked door. Whoops, couldn't forget about Asahina. She still seemed pretty dumbfounded by all this, and she took a moment to catch up with me. She had the same timid demeanor she always had when she came here. It was though her nervous face was surrounded by question marks there in the elevator. Nagato opening the door and letting us into her apartment didn't do anything to change Asahina's expression. Nagato seemed unhurried. Despite being back at her house, she changed into her school uniform. The fact that it made me feel so at ease wasn't because I had a school uniform fetish, but rather because I knew she would understand my situation. Earlier, I'd lost consciousness as I watched a short-haired figure in a school uniform holding a knife. Given what we were about to do, it would probably be hard for my past self to see her in any other outfit. I doubt I would mistake Nagato for anyone else, but the uniform had really become her trademark. She wordlessly indicated that we should sit in the living room as she went to the kitchen to prepare tea. I took the opportunity to relate to Asahina the details of the adventure before last. I don't believe it, Asahina murmured, her eyes wide and round. History was completely changed, and I didn't notice a thing. Her shock was understandable. The only one with an accurate memory during those 3 days was me, and without Nagato's hint and the other Haruhi's unhesitating action, I wouldn't have been able to do anything about it. A global alteration of space-time and direct intervention from the future. For both of those things to happen at the same time, it's... Asahina's voice quivered as her gaze swam around the Spartan room. There were 3 cups of tea now on the table in the living room. Nagato had made it for us, but Asahina was so stunned as she listened to my explanation, and Nagato's occasional yes, that she didn't touch her cup, and it was growing cool. Diagonally from me, Nagato regarded Asahina, then looked at me before looking again at Asahina. I had a pretty good idea of what Nagato wanted to say. What I explained to Asahina was that errors had accumulated in Nagato's system, causing her to rewrite the world on December 18th. But that using her escape program, I'd been able to successfully travel back in time, to the day of Tanabata 4 years earlier. There, I enlisted the age of a pre-buggy Nagato to make it back to December 18th, but there I had the misfortune of encountering Ryoko Asakura, who mortally wounded me. But just before I lost consciousness, I'd seen Nagato and Asahina, along with myself, presumably having traveled back from the future to set things right. Nagato might have some things to add to this incomprehensible explanation. And that wasn't even the whole story. I hadn't said anything about the fact that the elder Asahina had waited for me there 4 years in the past. I wasn't at all certain it was something I should mention. It was obvious that the elder Asahina was keeping her younger counterpart deliberately in the dark about all this. The younger Asahina was still in regular contact with the future, so if it were that important for her to know something, I'd leave it to her superiors to clue her in. I didn't know anything about the information exchange system, but I could make an educated guess based on things she said. When I asked for details, it was totally classified. She said that earlier. Asahina didn't know. Knowledge was being deliberately kept from her. I had no idea why that was, but it was obvious to me. It occurred to me several times that she was awfully careless for a time traveler. The August where we nearly got stuck in an infinite time loop, and the strange house that suddenly appeared in the middle of the blizzard. At the very least, she could have given us some kind of futuristic warning so we could have avoided the trouble of those 2 incidents. So why hadn't she? I had an idea why. Asahina the Elder had to know everything. Her former self, that is to say, the current Asahina, had to go through all these experiences. Anything that lets us avoid them would change her own history. Perhaps she had no choice but to experience these things, just as Nagato could predict her own malfunction, but in the end could do nothing to avoid it. But it made me feel truly sorry for the current Asahina. She endured even more moments of shock throughout her SOS Brigade experiences than I had. I was even starting to be suspicious of her real purpose in this time period. If they just needed to surveil Haruhi, wouldn't a simple spy camera have sufficed? There had to be something else. Something not even Asahina knows, but that her older sister does know. A freeze-dried voice addresses me as I was deep in thought. I have a favor to ask you. I was happy to listen to anything Nagato would ask of me. I want you to not say anything to myself in that time. Not even hey or hi? If possible, no. In Nagato's stoic eyes was visible a rare expressiveness. Her black pupils entreated me, and I would have sooner agreed to scoop the moon's reflection out of the pond than I would have refused her. Okay, if you say so, I'll try not to. The artlessly short head of hair nodded slowly. It fell to Nagato to explain the fine details of the space-time manipulation, and Asahina would be the one to faithfully carry them out. I'm sorry, but I didn't care how powerful Koizumi's agency was. They were no match for this alliance of alien and time traveler. Although I have no idea if they ever plan on fighting. The 3 of us, Nagato, Asahina, and I, went to the entryway to put on our shoes, our shoulders bumping into one another as we jostled in the tight space. Last month, when I traveled back in time with Asahina the Elder, we'd forgotten our shoes. The lesson had not been wasted on me. Thanks to Nagato's personality, the older Asahina's high heels were still there, 4 years later, but we couldn't very well return them to the current Asahina, so I said nothing. What time on December 18th last year was it again? In response to that question, Nagato gave the answer down to the second, at which Asahina nodded. Okay, here we go. Kyon, close your eyes. And then, time shifted. No matter how many times I experienced it, I felt the same way, a dizziness that brings me to the edge of nausea. Though my eyes were closed, there was a light flashing, and an indescribably uncomfortable feeling of falling backward, of loss of spatial orientation. The equilibrium of both my body and mind was gone, and it was like going around a roller coaster dozens of times in a row, and just when my sense of balance was on the verge of collapse, the soles of my feet registered contact with the ground. Gravity reassured its hold on my thankful body. We're here, Nagato said, almost whispering. I opened my eyes, and I was immediately shocked. I saw myself standing directly in front of the school gates. Recall, if you will, the last time I time jumped to this particular December 18th. I'd come from the Tanabata 4 years previous, having made the jump with Asahina the Elder at the past Nagato's behest. From the cover of darkness, I'd watched the present Nagato change the world, and then I'd stepped into the light. And we just now landed smack in the middle of that scene. The other me was now saying something to Nagato, who finished changing both the world and herself. I could also see the back of Asahina the Elder, who was wearing the jacket I lent her. This was dangerous. This was too close. Don't worry, my Nagato said in a monotone. They cannot see us. I've erected a light and sound isolation field. I suppose that meant from the perspective of past me, older Asahina, and Glasses Nagato, the three of us were silent, transparent beings. Maybe the reason Nagato hadn't bitten us this time was because she was personally present. Asahina blinked rapidly. Who is that woman? She seems like an adult, but why is she here? We could only see Asahina the Elder from behind, after all. It wasn't surprising that Asahina couldn't recognize the woman, and this simply inferred that the person was actually an older version of her required an even greater mental leap. Just as I agonized over whether to tell her, my thoughts were obliterated by what happened next. Though I knew it was coming, watching it from the outside still gave me goosebumps. A dark form bolted out of the shadows. Just after it swept past us, I realized it was Ryoko Asakura, lunging toward my other self, about to slam into him. No, she did slam into him, hard, and holding a knife at her waist. Asahina the Elder cried out as my useless other self was stabbed, just as I remember being. Ooh. Definitely looked painful. I hadn't noticed it at the time, but Asakura was twisting the knife back and forth. She was murderous. She was really trying to kill me. Asakura, the corrupt backup, was guilty of attempted murder. I had collapsed on the ground. Kyon! Asahina called out, and started to run to my other self, but she soon collided with the invisible barrier. No! She cried, looking up. In the moment, she must have forgotten that I was still right beside her. All I could see was the collapsed me across the way. I felt both grateful and not. Nagato! Asahina shouted. In response, Nagato nodded softly. Dissolving barrier, now. Asahina ran out as Nagato herself began to move, more swiftly than the night wind. Nagato was upon Asakura a moment later, grabbing Asakura's upheld knife blade with her hand. Asakura's cry, a mix of shock and hatred, reached my ears as I reached myself. Jesus, I look like shit. Asahina the Younger clung tearfully to my collapsed body. It was nice that she was worried about me and all, but if she kept shaking me like that, she was just gonna make me die faster. Luckily, she was kneeling and desperately calling out to me so fervently that she forgot all about the other woman. It was enough to make me want to thank her. The silent Asahina the Elder looked up from where her gaze had been to regard me. So you came. I was still a bit late, though. Not in terms of time, but mentally. What? The voice was Nagato, exactly as I remembered her. It pained my heart to see her there, still wearing glasses, having fallen as she stumbled back. Her expression one of shock. Her dark eyes moved from my other self's collapsed form, to Asakura, to her school uniform-clad doppelganger, then finally to me. Why? I had promised Nagato, which meant I could say nothing to this Nagato, the one who had just rewritten the world. There was only one thing I could do, one thing to say. I picked up the needle gun from the Nagato from 3 years ago I'd made, then looked down at myself. I opened my mouth to say the line I remembered hearing. I was pretty sure I got it right, and even if I didn't, I was sure a bit of deviation would be allowed. My other self's barely opened eyes finally closed completely, and his neck slumped sideways. It was a textbook loss of consciousness, good enough to make it look like I actually died, and if we didn't stop my bleeding soon, I really would die. Now it was my turn, even though starting then, I didn't know what was going to happen. The first thing I looked at was my Nagato stopping Asakura. The knife that Nagato held turned to sparkling dust. Asakura tried to jump back, but her feet held fast to the ground, as if struck there. Nagato murmured in a quiet, rapid voice. "No, why? Isn't this..." Asakura's body began to shimmer. "Isn't this what you wished for? Why, even now?" Asakura fell silent with the question on her lips, as the dissolution of the knife was followed by that of her own body, which finally crumbled and scattered. At the same time, Asina the Younger had fallen prostrate over my body. With her closed eyes and her barely parted lips, she looked for all the world like she was sleeping. Asina the Elder's hand lay softly on the nape of my lovely upperclassman's neck. "Don't worry, I put her to sleep." The adult Asahina stroked her younger self head sadly. "She mustn't learn that I'm here. I had to make sure this wouldn't happen." My Asahina breathed softly as she slept, her head pillowed on my unconscious self's slack arm. "I have to stay a secret to her." Asahina's sleeping face looked exactly like it had on that park bench at Tanabata 3 years ago. The reasoning was likewise the same. Asina the Elder didn't want to reveal herself to her past self. Catching a glimpse of her from behind was one thing, but if we'd gotten close, the older Asahina's identity would have been obvious. Nagato knelt on one knee, putting her hand on the spot on my torso where I'd been knifed. That's obviously what saved me. In any case, the bleeding stopped, and my face looked a little less pallid. So it had been Nagato who healed my wound. Nagato stood without ceremony, then held out her hand and spoke. "Give it." I silently handed her the gun. I hadn't been able to do anything with it anyway. I just couldn't make myself do it. I didn't want to pull the trigger on any Nagato, at any time. Nagato took the gun unconcernedly, then aimed it at her collapsed, glasses-wearing other self, and pulled the trigger. There was no sound, and I saw nothing miraculous fire from the gun, but... Nagato with the glasses blinked, then slowly got to her feet. She stood there, ramrod straight, very much like the Nagato I knew so well. Not the girl who had given me the application form for her club, tugged hesitantly on my sleeve, and smiled shyly and faintly. As though to confirm my thoughts, that Nagato smoothly removed her glasses, then after glancing to me with her own eyes, locked her emotionless gaze on her other self. Request synchronization. The two Nagatos stared each other down. This incident included, I'd had several occasions to see my other self. My retinas had also been graced by the sight of both Asina the Younger and Elder, but this was the first time I'd seen two of Nagato, and it was strangely moving. Magnificent, even. Request synchronization. The gunshot Nagato repeated. The Nagato holding the pistol responded immediately. Denied. Even I thought this was weird, to say nothing of the Nagato who now held her glasses in her hand. Her eyebrows moved a millimeter. Why? I do not wish to. I was stunned. Had Nagato ever so clearly expressed a preference? It wasn't an excuse. She had definitively and unambiguously spoken words of emotional refusal. The other Nagato fell silent, as though in deep thought. The night wind ruffled her hair. The Nagato who had come back from the future with me spoke. You will reset the world changes you affected. Understood, said the other Nagato, but then continued on to say, I cannot detect the existence of the data overmind. It is not here, replied my Nagato indifferently. I am still connected to the data overmind in my own space-time. I will affect the reversion of changes. Understood, said past Nagato. After the revision, continued my Nagato, take whatever actions you wish. The newly repaired other Nagato looked to me, her head cocked ever so slightly. I was certain of the invisible information her expression revealed. Nobody understands Nagato's feelings the way I do. This Nagato is that Nagato. The Nagato who appeared at the hospital that night. That is her. The one who made me so angry by claiming that her punishment was being debated. I also understood why the Nagato who came from the future with me rejected synchronization. She didn't want to tell her current self what action to take when the time comes. Why, you ask? It goes without saying. Thank you. The words I heard from Nagato then are the answer. Kyon, said Asahina the elder to me, hesitantly, as I stood there stock still. Please take care of her. Of me. She went to pick up her heavy-looking younger self, who was still deeply sleeping. I hurried over to lend a hand, and no sooner than she asked me to help than I'd gotten the lesser Asahina on my back, her warmth and softness just as I remembered it. A large-scale time quake will soon occur. Asahina the elder hugged her shoulders, her face anxious. This is a larger, more complicated space-time modification than the one that just happened. I don't think we'll be able to keep our eyes open this time. If she said so, I believe it. But why would this be any different? I asked. The first change only changed the past and present. Now, in addition to that, we must take pains to restore time to its original flow. Think back. Where do you remember waking up? The evening of December 21st. I regained consciousness in the hospital. That's right. So we have to arrange things for that to come about. My blazer still hanging over her shoulders, the barefoot older Asahina drew closer to me. Looking somehow melancholy, she touched my shoulder, upon which Asahina the younger still rested, then turned her head to regard Nagato. The Nagato who had come here with me now walked over to join us, the other remaining where she stood, and my collapsed other self still lying on the ground. Asahina the elder put her other hand on Nagato's shoulder. If you please, Nagato. Nagato nodded faintly, then looked over at the other self, as if acknowledging that this would be their final parting. The other Nagato said nothing. I got the impression that she was lonely, which might have been my imagination, but I didn't worry about it. I remember what I said, what my other self, still lying on the ground, would soon say. Relax and come visit me in the hospital. And don't forget to tell your boss to drop dead. Close your eyes, Kyon, whispered Asahina the elder. We can't have you getting time sick. I took her advice and squeezed my eyes shut. The next moment, I felt the world twist around me. Whoa! I'd experienced the weightless, spinning sensation many times, and while I felt like I was getting used to it, the magnitude of the spinning felt different this time. Previously, it had felt like an amusement park roller coaster, but this was like being inside a spaceship that was blasting randomly around, and I'd forgotten to fasten my seatbelt. But since gravity was not acting on my body, nor was I actually being spun around, this was simple dizziness. Though I wanted to see what was going on outside me, opening my eyes made the drunken feeling terrifyingly worse, so the only vision I had were the flashes of light that sparkled behind my closed eyes. I was very grateful for both the weight of Asahina the younger on my back and her older counterpart's hand on my shoulder. And then, there was a piercing, dangerous flash of light that penetrated my closed eyelids. Unable to resist the desire to see, I opened my eyes, and I understood the source of the flashing red light. Only emergency vehicles are allowed to have red lights like that. It was... An ambulance was parked in front of the North High School entrance. Rubbernecking students looked on from a distance as emergency personnel carried someone out of the stretcher. Two forms walked alongside the stretcher as it moved. Two forms whose names I'll never forget as long as I live. Haruhi looked pale and scared, and Asahina's face was streaked with tears as they followed the paramedics, with an unsmiling Koizumi trailing behind them. The stretcher was immediately loaded into the ambulance, and Haruhi got in as well, after a short exchange with the paramedics. The flashing red lights and siren got bumped up a notch, and the ambulance started to move. Asahina covered her face as Koizumi had a serious conversation on his cell phone. Nagato was not there, but that was to be expected. Some part of my body felt Asahina the elder let out a sigh of relief. Now, we can return to your own time, Kyon. The scene faded out. I guess this was the end of this particular bonus scene. I closed my eyes. It had been worth seeing, a fragment of these days of which I had no memory. That's right. Haruhi had claimed it was the brigade chief's duty to be concerned about her brigade members. The dizzy feeling started up again. I was desperate for some motion sickness medication. Next time, I'll be sure to bring some. I'll aim for the time coordinates you came from. Be nice to me, won't you? It will take a while before I wake up. You can even kiss me if you want. Asahina the elder's lingering, mischievous voice felt very distant. And then, when I opened my eyes, I was standing in Nagato's living room with Asahina on my back. Nagato stood facing me. 62 seconds have elapsed since we departed, she said, looking up at me. We have returned to our own time. I let out a deep breath and lowered Asahina on the floor. Her sleeping face was definitely a top candidate for most kissable, but I wasn't so naive as to take the other Asahina's words so literally. Of course, were this not Nagato's living room, and were Nagato not currently observing me, I might have given in the sketchy behavior. But no, I wouldn't. No, I wouldn't. You hearing me, guys? No, I wouldn't. Taking my teacup off the table, I downed the remaining tea in one gulp. It had turned lukewarm before we started time traveling, but it was still awfully tasty. It was perfect, like having barley tea right after a bath. It was even a match for the tea Asahina brewed in the clubroom. Jeez. I felt like I'd finally sorted out all the trouble from the previous year. There was nothing more that needed doing. We'd changed the world back to what it needed to be and gotten back from the club trip that had overlapped into the new year. All that remained was the first temple visit of the year. Oh, sure, Haruhi would probably come up with something strange, but until then, I figured I'd be able to relax a bit. Incidentally, the angelic time traveler didn't seem to be waking up. The method by which she'd been put to sleep was unclear, but her sleeping face looked as happy as Shamisen's did when he had a full belly and was curled up somewhere warm, so I was loath to wake her. I asked Nagato to get a futon ready for her in the guest room, then carried her there and tucked her in. Hey Nagato, do me a favor and take care of her until she wakes up, okay? Nagato was certainly getting her fill of sleeping guests, but she looked at me and nodded. I would have loved to stay until Asahina woke, but to be honest, I was utterly weary myself. If I didn't get home soon and ameliorate my exhaustion via a good bath in my own bed, there was no way I'd be able to be up tomorrow morning by 9, and I wanted to put an end to the evaporation of my wallet's limited resources. 5 people's worth of New Year's cash would have been a crushing blow. It would have been nice to crawl into a futon next to Asahina, like I'd done back when I slept through 3 years earlier after Tanabata, and while I'm completely confident that I would have fallen immensely asleep upon putting my head to pillow, I couldn't help but feel that nobody was asking for me to sleep there. Plus, it was kinda nice that the time traveler was crashing at the alien's place. See you tomorrow. Understood. Nagato saw me off with a gaze that put me at ease, her tranquil pupils fixing on me from behind her bangs. Good work today. Sorry we caused you so much trouble. Asahina had done her part, but Nagato, and her counterpart, had put in the most effort. It's fine, she said, her expression unchanging. I was the cause. I watched the alien until the door closed. I'd wondered if she would possibly smile, but unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, her pale face and small frame were as impassive as ever. And yet you can thank my keen eyes for noticing that there was a hint of something different. I rode my bike slowly home after leaving the apartment building, and I fell asleep immediately after falling down on my bed. Somehow I got the feeling that the dreams I had in my exhausted sleep were really great ones, but 30 seconds after I woke up, I'd forgotten them entirely. But the lingering feeling told me everything. I'm sure it was about an alien and a time traveler enjoying a pleasant tea together. And so it was that just as I lowered Asahina off my shoulders, I'd planned to cast off my worries and enjoy a relatively peaceful January. But a single problem remained. Her sleeping face had been so lovely that it entirely slipped my mind, that precisely because the sleeping Asahina was asleep, from her perspective she'd seen and heard almost nothing of what Nagato, Asahina the Elder, and I had done that December 18th. As far as she knew, I'd suddenly told her that space-time had been altered, and, half disbelieving, she'd taken us back in time, only to see my other self immediately struck down and immediately rendered unconscious herself, and when she woke, she'd already be back in her own time. As far as I was concerned, she fulfilled her role perfectly well, by doing something only she could do, but Asahina herself evidently didn't see it that way. Now that I thought about it, ever since the winter break had ended, she seemed to be constantly getting lost in thought. This, as we all know, is connected to that melancholy Sunday pseudo-date she asked me out on, where we barely saved that boy in glasses from the traffic incident. If I had to take a guess, I'd blame it on Asahina the Elder's policy of secrecy. While it was true that anyone who would make Asahina cry deserved a thorough pummeling, I wonder if I hadn't been more often the cause of her tears myself. Maybe I needed to get Haruhi to go to a boxing gym with me. A little bit of punching and getting punched might do me good, I thought. In any case, the Sunday of tea shopping got me thinking about my future of the SOS Brigade, and so it succeeded in lifting Asahina's spirits. To be honest, I'm not sure how much she figured out, but we reached enough of an understanding that detailed explanations weren't necessary, at least not to this Asahina. Just as I don't mention the name John Smith to Haruhi, I'll never tell Asahina about the existence of her adult self. It's a trump card, only for emergencies. And should the time come, well, I don't want that time to come. As we enter February, our story returns to its beginning. Towards the end of the school year, the mood around the school changes somehow. You start to see the seniors around less, for example. Most of them were now toiling in the depths of their college entrance exams, which makes the teacher's room a tense place to be. Come the year after next, I'll be a senior myself. That will be me. If this year's senior class doesn't rouse themselves to beating the municipal high school college acceptance rate, the principal is going to be pushing extra classes or mock exams that cancel the school anniversary, which would only serve to annoy me, since I'm still 2 years away from seniorhood. Speaking of exams, it was about time for the diagnostic tests that the entering middle school students would take to get into special classes, of which my school had a couple. Koizumi's Class 9 specialized in science and math. I don't know whether it was the shadowy agency backing them that get Koizumi into that class, or if it was just his own academic ability, but either way, it was impressive for the transfer student to get in. I sure as hell didn't have any interest in a class whose main dish would be extra helpings of math and science. Ugh. In any case, I turned my attention away from the hell of college entrance exams, into which I'd inevitably descend, purposefully avoiding the calendar in an effort to extend my few remaining days of life as a freshman. And once I got back from that fateful December 18th, carefully maintained my state of relaxation. After all, I sure can't think of anything more dangerous than repairing space-time, and having successfully done so, surely I deserve some R&R. Nagato had returned to her usual self, Asahina's smile was back, and while something was up with Haruhi, she'd start making noise about it soon enough. So there really shouldn't have been any problems at all, or at least I didn't want to think about them. But there was one person in the club room who selfishly insisted on making mountains out of molehills, the only one, like Haruhi, who had been left out of the loop. The Esper whose powers were useless when it came to changing space-time. One Itsuki Koizumi, who said, "You've repeatedly visited 2 separate mornings of December 18th. Koizumi had enjoyed hearing about the time travel incidents I'd been through ever since the episode at the snowy mountain mansion, pestering me to relate them to him like a kid begging for his grandfather for another story. As an aspiring time traveler, he seemed to envy me. Taking the train back from Tsurya's villa, he'd gone on and on about, "Might you not find some way to take me back with you?" And, "It should be fine as long as your past self doesn't see me." But it went without saying that I paid him no heed. I was still deeply embarrassed about the whole Nagato thing, and although it was all over and settled, I still tended to prevaricate about it. But in the face of Koizumi's curiosity-born persistence, and when the two of us were in the club room, I finally told him the whole story. As expected, he happily began his commentary. "You see, it was the morning of December 18th when the malfunctioning Nagato changed the world into one where Suzumiya and I, and even Asahina, were all normal people. You spent 3 days in that world, then used Nagato's escape program to travel 4 years into the past. There, you met the still functioning Nagato and returned to the morning of December 18th. That was all true, and incidentally, I'd now been back to that morning yet again, I told him. "I know, but think carefully now. Suppose we refer to the moment Nagato changed the world on the morning of December 18th as Time X. When you returned to Time X from Tanabata 4 years previous, it was no longer the same X." What was he talking about? There was no way there could be more than one version of the same time, I told him. "There can. In fact, there must. The reasoning is simple. If the Time X where Nagato changed the world disappeared, then neither Suzumiya's disappearance, nor her and my transformation into regular people would have happened. And if that was the case, you would never have needed to travel into the past." He was talking about a time paradox. I had plenty of first-hand experiences with those, I said. "But a necessary precondition for returning this world to its previous state was you traveling into the past. If you hadn't, the world wouldn't have stayed changed. But you did go, and you did repair it. Otherwise, this timeline would not exist." I glanced over at the door, hoping desperately that someone would come in and interrupt this conversation. "Let me use a diagram to explain. It might make it easier to understand." Ever since the incident, Koizumi seemed to have gotten really into diagrams. He took an erasable pen and walked over to the whiteboard. "Say this vertical line represents the flow of time from past to future." He stopped the line in the middle of the board, drawing a dot and labeling it with an X. "This is the first time X. This is where Nagato changed the world that surrounded her, and where the time as it exists in your memory was created." Koizumi resumed the movement with the pen, but he did not directly continue the line. Instead, it curved to the right, eventually creating a circle that returned to point X. The diagram now looked like a morning glory sprout with one leaf plucked off. "The circle is the history that you remember since December 18th.
You used the escape program to travel back to the Tanabata 4 years earlier, then jump back to the morning of December 18th. If Nagato had just been repaired at that moment, everything would have been fine. But that's not how it went.
Yeah, because Ryoko Asakura was there. But Asakura wasn't the only one there. There's also another version of me from the future, along with Asahina and Nagato, and we managed to put things right. From my perspective now, it happened a month ago.
Indeed, you saved yourself, and that...
Koizumi's pen started to X again, this time drawing a circle that looped to the left.
Is this point, from which this world is now continuing. In Suzumiya's memory as in mine, you fell down the stairs on December 18th and were unconscious until the 21st. And a month later, you would travel back from this timeline to go save yourself.
Once he finished drawing the circle to the left of the line, Koizumi didn't stop. He then continued on past the X, extending the line up until it reached the top edge of the board, then setting the pen down. Koizumi then took a half step back from the board and regarded me carefully. I quickly grasped the nature of the diagram. It looked like an 8 turned sideways, the symbol for infinity, with a line exactly bisecting the point between the two loops. Point X was where all the lines met. Even I, who long proclaimed my cowardice in the face of math and science, gradually began to understand what Koizumi was trying to explain. The loop on the right was the time in my memory. After a lot of hassle, I returned to Point X and met Glasses Nagato just as she was changing the world, then got stabbed by Asakura. On the other hand, the loop on the left was the time of which I had no memory. I'd been stabbed, lost consciousness, been taken to the hospital where I was in a bed for 3 days until waking up, all within that loop. And both of these loops had their start at X.
Which means that there are 2 points X, explained Koizumi. There's point X, where the world was changed, and let's call it X1, where the change was undone,
he said, looking contemplatively at his diagram.
Without X, there can be no X1, so X was not erased. You can probably think of them as being superimposed. Yeah, one written on top of the other. Just as old data covered up by new data written atop it, X, along with the changed world that followed from it, was overwritten by X1. But it hasn't disappeared completely, it's still there.
I do not remotely understand, I said with nonchalance, even as I recalled Asahina the Elder's words.
An even larger and more complex space-time quake, she said. It's something like looking at a multi-level circuit board from above. There are 2 points where the circuits appear across each other in 2 dimensions, but when you factor in the 3rd dimension, you see they're on different levels. Things that appear to occupy the same space in 2 dimensions differ in depth.
I rubbed my temples. Koizumi was explaining all this, but I wondered what a time traveler would say. Or an alien.
There is another possibility. May I explain?
Given the circumstances, I'd listen to whatever the hell he wanted to say.
The memory that you lack, but which we have, the 3 days between December 18th, when you fell down the stairs, and December 21st, when you awoke, that may never have existed.
Did it matter one way or another? I've been asleep either way, I said.
Indeed, it's precisely as you say. Do you remember what I said earlier? We can't prove for certain that the entire universe wasn't created 5 minutes ago. It's possible that the time between your repair of December 18th and your awakening on December 21st didn't exist, which would mean that Suzumiya and my memory of those 3 days is completely fabricated, and we were made to hold them after the reconstruction of the night of the 21st.
I did agree to listen, but this is just ridiculous. But, unfortunately, it wasn't impossible. It was possible to rewrite an entire year, when considering that these 3 days were small by comparison.
Also, this is changing the subject, but we can now state the identity of the mystery girl that Suzumiya saw.
Who was it? Who pushed me down the stairs?
It was Nagato.
Now he was just talking nonsense. Hadn't Nagato been at the bottom of the stairs with everyone else at the time? They said I was at the tail end of the group, hadn't they?
Yes, that is what we remember. Nagato didn't directly shove you from behind. However, she was the one who created the history wherein you've been knocked unconscious. Suzumiya must have subconsciously realized that fact. Of course, she doesn't know that Nagato was the culprit. In reality, the culprit wasn't there. And yet somehow Suzumiya sensed the fact that someone was behind all this.
Koizumi smiled brightly.
That feeling of suspicion became the image of a girl pushing you. A phantom girl who never really existed.
You could hardly use intuition to explain away all that. If Nagato could change the world, she could certainly alter a few memories. Yet Haruhi had realized that something was amiss, that someone was doing something, or had done something.
It's just a theory, a hypothesis I created to answer your questions.
The pleasant bastard sat down in a folding chair and spread his arms wide.
Practically speaking, I don't know the first thing about time construction and movement, but Asahina came from the future to accomplish something here. So this was my question. If you were in the position to travel into the past in order to avert a disaster, would you do it?
I thought of Asahina the Elder on the night of Tanabata, surrounded by a Haruhi and Koizumi who had gone to a different school, an Asahina who stayed in the calligraphy club, and a glasses-wearing Nagato. I'd pushed enter on the computer and traveled back in time again. The version of myself sitting on a bench at the park. The version of myself helping a middle school-aged Haruhi draw pictures in the school courtyard. If I had gone running up to my other self, what would have happened? If I told him everything that would happen, if I told him not to let Haruhi make a movie, not to cause Nagato constant trouble, if I spilled my guts to him, all I could do was shrug my shoulders. I have no idea. When an opportunity like that comes up, your body moves on its own before you can think. I didn't really trust my brain, but my body knew what it should do. That had gotten me this far, and I'd figured I'd keep it up. Good luck, self. Still, though, I really don't think there'll be any more time travel. The whole reason for doing it is gone now.
That's a shame. I've been hoping you'd take me along next time.
I didn't care if his eyes looked as desperate as Shamisen's when he's hungry in the middle of the night. He could go ask Asahina, and not the current Asahina, but Asahina the Elder. Not that I had any idea where or when she was. The only thing I could tell him was to make sure to bring motion sickness medication. Koizumi shook his head resignedly and returned to the game of shogi he was playing against himself. My attention drifted back to the manga magazine I'd been reading, and silence returned to the room.
Sorry to keep you waiting!
Wham! The door slammed open, kicked, and the main ingredient of all this chaos entered. Haruhi the Omnipotent smiled with pointless energy, a convenience store shopping bag in her hand, her skirt and her hair fluttering attractively.
The snack shop nearby didn't have all this stuff, so I had to go all the way down the hill. Whew, it's cold.
Following soon after the brigade chief, who was now warming her hands by the electric heater in the corner of the room, came Nagato and Asahina. Nagato silently closed the door.
What do we do with this?
Asked Asahina, her head cocked at a puzzled angle.
Isn't it obvious? Don't you know what day it is, Mikuru? I mean, did you just buy this stuff without realizing it? It's February 3rd, but, It's Setsubun! Setsubun!
Haruhi pronounced a small packet from within the convenience store shopping bag.
Honestly, you're just hopeless. Didn't you celebrate it when you were a kid? Today's Setsubun, and Setsubun equals bean throwing and eomaki eating.
It's true that eomaki, or the practice of eating a whole piece of futomaki in an auspicious direction while contemplating one's hopes for the upcoming year, was, of course, an obscure local tradition, but our brigade chief was a fanatic about observing every obscure seasonal tradition she could. If you said we weren't the Save the World by Overloading It with Fun Haruhi Suzumiya Brigade, but instead the Save the World by Celebrating Every Obscure Seasonal Event Brigade, you wouldn't have been wrong.
Ooh, what's that? Is that a Bernoulli curve?
Haruhi spied the diagram Koizumi had written on the whiteboard, suspiciously scrutinizing the path I'd taken through time as though it were a kid she thought she knew.
No, it's not. What kind of calculation yielded this curve?
She asked.
It's just a scribble.
Koizumi said casually as he stood and used the eraser to clean the board.
I was just killing time. Pay it no mind.
Right.
Ah,
replied Haruhi mildly. Having decided it wasn't important, she tossed the convenience store bag to me. It landed in my hand with a rustle, and there was a package of dried soybeans inside. Today was Setsubun, and being Setsubun, there had to be bean scattering, or so Haruhi had been thinking all through lunch, when she finally shouted in self-reproach,
I knew I was forgetting something! Setsubun!
She probably realized it after seeing the sushi rolls in Taniguchi's lunchbox. Oh, come on, Taniguchi had said, bitter disappointment in his voice. This is it? No side dishes? Just be happy someone made you a lunch, I shot back. Though in my heart I could not sympathize with the parent who'd pack a lunch like that, I agreed with the son. They could at least cut the roll up before packing it, so that wouldn't catch Haruhi's eye.
We can't just celebrate foreign holidays. Local traditions have a right to get some respect too. I mean, otherwise, it's just a waste. You're just missing out on all the fun. People who lose track of their roots are just gonna wind up going down the wrong path.
She was one to talk. Did she really think she was heading down the right path? From where I stood, it seems like she was always just changing the wrong way down some random animal path, I said.
What are you talking about? I walk the path of righteousness. I do that which must be done. I bet you forgot it was Setsubun today, Kyon. That's hard to forgive.
Even though she herself had also forgotten, or perhaps because of that, as soon as homeroom ended, Haruhi threw herself into preparations. If you can call them that, all she needed were beans and sushi rolls. She went to get them herself. Since I had been lucky enough to get a lecture from Mr. Okabe under the pretenses of academic counseling, and Koizumi had cleaning duty, she brought Nagato and Asahina along to help her carry things, and after school the three of them set off on their merry way. They had just now returned, which brought us to the present moment. As far as the sushi rolls went, we could just eat those while facing the proper direction, but beans had to be thrown at something. So where do you propose to do the scattering? I asked, opening the package and popping a bean into my mouth. It would have gone well with some tea. It would be a pain to clean up if we do it in the club room, not to mention a waste.
Oh, we could do it anywhere, said Haruhi, eyes blazing. Oh, yeah, what about tossing them from the top floor hallway's windows down into the courtyard? That way, the birds can just eat the beans and we won't have to do any cleaning up.
She then added,
We already got our good fortune girls, so we gotta do this upright.
Apparently, no Setsubun is truly complete without good fortune girls who dress up like shrine maidens and hand out good luck charms. The target of the SOS Brigade's chief's type La Supernova strength gaze was Asahina, who was assiduously reading the text printed on the bag of beans, and Nagato, who had already seated herself at the table, absorbed in a detective novel with a disturbing-sounding title. Ah, indeed. If you were going to hold a school-wide good fortune girl contest, the likely winner as well as the special judge's prize awardee were both sitting right here, and even setting that aside, they were perfectly suited for this sort of evil spirit banishment, given that Asahina could pretend, and Nagato would actually do the banishing. Haruhi tolerated no complaint as she dragged Asahina up to the hallway on the top floor of our school, the rest of us trailing behind them, whereupon we complied with an order to begin scattering, the three girls doing the actual scattering, with Koizumi and me in charge of keeping their bean scoops. And there was no question that for once, Haruhi's direction was resulting in a good outcome for everyone involved. At first, the students down in the courtyard had scattered like cockroaches fleeing insecticide, but soon groups of guys started their return to collect the beans that Asahina and Nagato had tossed down, milling about to and fro as they pursued the precious items. They were all of one mind in moving to dodge the shotgun blast that resulted from Haruhi's over-enthusiastic throwing.
Oh shoot,
said Haruhi with genuine regret.
I should have me crew dressed like a shrine maiden. We could have made some money that way. Even 100 yen a pop would have gotten us quite a bit, don't you think?
If she dressed up like that and walked around the school, I had no doubt that Asahina would become even more popular than she already was. But if only to keep my worries from multiplying any further, it was best to restrict our costumes to clubroom only.
Good luck! In there! Good luck in...
Incidentally, they were only shouting, "Good luck in." As to why...
Ever since I read The Red Demon Who Cried, I've always thought about if I ever did see a real demon, I'd want to be nice to it. I just bawled my eyes out when I read that story. The second I saw his sign, I totally would have gone right over to the Red Demon's house for tea and snacks.
She was totally on the demon's side as she looked at me gravely.
Got that? If you ever run into the Blue Demon, you better be nice to him. Shutting the demons outside is prohibited. The SOS Brigade's doors are open to all, even non-humans.
Although I had the premonition that if this half-baked inconclusiveness continued, we'd soon end up with so much luck that eventually something would pop up like an invisible balloon, I had to agree with Haruhi on the matter of the Blue Demon. That might have been because, as an impressionable kid, I cried over the story myself. Or perhaps it was because of an addition to scattering beans, Nagato was wearing a cheap demon mask on the side of her head. Nagato had been listening as she read the fairy tale Haruhi had mentioned, and had for some reason taken an interest in the paper demon mask, picking it up quietly and scanning it, laser-like, before putting it on her head. I wondered if Haruhi's phrase, "even non-humans," had somehow touched her heart. After Asahina and Nagato's free bean-throwing performance ended, we all returned to the clubroom to wolf down our ehomaki. We looked up this year's lucky direction on the internet, and Haruhi passed out the food.
You can't say a word until we're done eating, got it? Okay, everybody stand up. Now face that way, and let's eat!
The strange scene, all five of us lined up and facing the same direction, our mouths full as we silently ate chilled sushi rolls, continued for several minutes. Haruhi and Nagato finished first, roughly simultaneously, while Asahina held hers daintily in both hands like a small woodland creature. I fervently prayed that we wouldn't be having the same thing for dinner tonight. The remaining beans were emptied into a bowl and ended up mostly in Haruhi's and my stomachs, along with some tea that Asuna kindly brewed, giving me a new appreciation for how full a person could wind up on Setsubun. Surely this would return Haruhi's spirits to normal, but for some reason, the next day she was still subdued. As I said before, the fact that remembering Setsubun had improved her mood so thoroughly proved that she wasn't seriously melancholy, but that only made me more worried about this subtle shift. It seemed I was the only one who noticed this change in Haruhi. It would have been one thing if minor characters like Taniguchi or Kunakita hadn't noticed, but apparently even the self-proclaimed Haruhi expert Koizumi hadn't detected it. It was just weird. While I couldn't get the thought out of my head, I also couldn't very well constantly pay attention to Haruhi's movements, because something more obviously strange had happened. And unlike Haruhi's shift in mood, this one was a thing you could see with your own two eyes. I just told Koizumi that I didn't anticipate there being any further time travel episodes for a while, and I stuck to that. I wanted to avoid anything involving going back in time and changing things there. There isn't a kind of thing you should do over and over again, and definitely not when you don't know why you're doing it. Whether or not my pathetic wish was heard, well, it wound up coming true anyway. This time, it wasn't me who traveled through time. I didn't take a single step outside my own present moment, and yet I still wound up getting sucked into another temporal disturbance. The person in question appeared in the literature club's mop closet.